AITA for not letting my parents sell the house that is under my name to help them out with their financial hardship. I never wanted to be in this position, and honestly, if I could go back in time and make a different choice, I would. But I was young, naive, and, more than anything, I wanted to believe my parents had my best interests at heart. Years ago, when they first came to me about putting the house in my name, I hesitated. I knew their history with money. I had seen them struggle my entire life, watched them live paycheck to paycheck, constantly scrambling to make ends meet. I knew the pattern well: big dreams, big risks, and then the inevitable crash when reality set in. When they first approached me, they made it sound like this was going to be an investment in my future. "It will be yours in the end," they said. "This will be good for you." But I knew, deep down, that this wasn't about me. I voiced my concerns. I told them I didn't want to do it. But my father, ever the persuasive one, insisted that it was the best thing to do. He reassured me that I would benefit in the long run and that they just needed my name on paper. I was young, and they made me feel like I was being unreasonable, like I was selfish for even questioning it. And so, against my better judgment, I agreed. Years passed. I got married. I built a life. My husband and I work hard, and while we are comfortable, we are by no means rich. We save carefully because I know what it's like to live without savings. I know what it's like to have nothing to fall back on. I learned from my parents' mistakes. I saw them struggle, never having a safety net, always scrambling to fix the latest financial disaster. I swore that I wouldn't let that happen to me, to my family. Fast forward to now, and suddenly, my parents are talking about selling the house. My dad says they need the money for an immigration lawyer and to buy a house in Mexico. They've been mentioning it more and more, but I never thought they would actually try to pressure me into selling. Then today, my dad dropped it into conversation like it was a done deal. "If anything, we'll just have to sell the house." I told him no. At first, he was taken aback, as if the idea of me saying no had never even crossed his mind. He looked at me and asked why. I asked him if he really didn't remember the conversation we had years ago, when he promised me that this house would be mine in the end. He kept pressing for an answer, pushing me, demanding to know why I would say no. Then he let it slip. He admitted that he had lied. He said he only told me that because he thought I would never get married. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. He had built this entire agreement on a lie. He never intended for me to keep the house. He just needed my name on the paperwork and figured that if I stayed single, I wouldn't fight him on it. I don't even know what hurt more, the fact that he had deceived me or the fact that he had assumed I would always be alone, that he had banked on me having no one to back me up. The conversation spiraled from there. He started yelling, saying I was selfish, that I was only thinking of myself. He said I had a good life now, that I was comfortable, while they were struggling. He accused me of wanting the house all for myself, of not caring about them. I stood my ground. I told him I had sacrificed for them for years. When I lived under their roof, I gave them everything. I helped out so much that I once ate out of a trash can at work because I literally didn't have enough money to buy myself lunch. I gave and gave and gave. I did everything a good daughter was supposed to do, everything they asked of me. And now, because I was finally standing up for myself, I was the selfish one. It didn't matter that I still help. I pay my mom $500 a month to watch my son. She only watches him about 4 times a month because I mostly work from home, but I still pay her the same amount even when he's on summer break and stays home with me full time. I don't ask for discounts, I don't complain, I just give because I know they need it. And still, my dad threw it in my face. He said I give my mom money, but I don't give him anything. He wanted me to at least give him $100 to help with the lawyer. Never mind the fact that I've given him money before, many times, and never once asked for it back. Never mind the fact that I have been helping them financially in one way or another for years. It's never enough. It will never be enough. I don't want to sell the house because I know what it could mean for my family. This isn't about greed. It's about security. It's about finally having something stable, something that I worked for, something that was supposed to be mine. And yet, my father still sees it as his to take. I don't know where we go from here. I don't know how to fix this. All I know is that I'm done being the one who sacrifices while everyone else takes. I did my part. I gave until I had nothing left. And now, when I finally have something of my own, I refuse to let it be taken from me. So, am I the asshole? Update 1. I wish I could say my father dropped the issue after our argument, but of course, he didn't. He never did. My parents had never been the type to accept no as an answer, not when they believed they were owed something. And in their minds, they were always owed something. If one tactic failed, they would simply switch to another, as if wearing me down through sheer persistence would eventually get them what they wanted. They had always operated this way, pushing, prodding, testing my limits, seeing just how far they could go before I finally caved. And for most of my life, I had caved. Not because I wanted to, but because it was easier than dealing with the fallout. But this time, I didn't bend. I refused. And that refusal triggered something in them, something ugly, something desperate. If they couldn't guilt me into selling the house, they would come at me from another angle. And this time, they decided to go through my husband. A few days after our argument, my husband came to me, his face twisted in confusion, holding up his phone. "Did you see this?" he asked, his voice uncertain. There was something in his tone that made my stomach tighten before I even looked at the screen. And then I saw it. A string of messages from both of my parents, separate but identical in their intent. They claimed my husband owed them money. At first, my mind couldn't even process what I was looking at. Owed them money? For what? We hadn't borrowed anything from them. If anything, the financial dynamic had always been the opposite. I felt a sharp pang of dread in my chest as I scrolled through the messages, my breath catching with every line. They were demanding repayment for an expensive wedding gift they had supposedly given us years ago. I actually laughed at first because it was so ridiculous, so far removed from reality that it almost felt like some kind of joke. But my husband wasn't laughing. "They sound serious," he said. And they were. The messages weren't light-hearted or joking in the slightest. They were long, winding texts, filled with guilt-tripping, veiled threats, and a heavy dose of entitlement. My father, ever the master manipulator, had written that since we had refused to sell the house, the least we could do was pay them back for all the help they had given us over the years. Help. That word made my blood boil. As if I hadn't spent years sacrificing for them. As if I hadn't gone without food just so they could pay their bills. As if I hadn't given my mother money every single month for childcare, despite the fact that she barely even watched my son. As if I hadn't, time and time again, put their needs above my own. None of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered to them was that I had finally dared to put my foot down. And they didn't like that. My mother's message was just as bad, if not worse. She wrote about how unfair it was that my husband and I were stable while they were struggling. How we could afford it. How it was only right that we helped, considering we had benefited from their generosity. Their generosity. The sheer audacity of it made my vision blur with rage. They were rewriting history, twisting reality to fit whatever narrative benefited them in the moment. They were acting as if they had graciously and selflessly given us something monumental, when in reality, I had been the one supporting them for years. I had given so much, too much, and now, instead of gratitude, I was being billed for it. I didn't even know how to respond. My first instinct was to call my mother, to talk to her rationally, to make her see how absurd this was. Surely, she would recognize that this had gone too far. But when I called, hoping she would talk some sense into my father, I was met with more of the same. "It's only fair," she said, her tone sharp and unwavering. "You and your husband are doing well. You can afford it." That was her reasoning. Not that we had actually borrowed anything. Not that we had agreed to repay anything. But simply that we could. And in their minds, that was reason enough. That was when it finally clicked. This was never just about money. This was about control. My parents had always viewed me as an extension of themselves, a resource to be used whenever it suited them. They never respected my autonomy, never saw me as an independent person with my own life, my own boundaries. I had always been theirs to manipulate, to guilt, to drain dry whenever they needed something. And now that I was pushing back, now that I was setting boundaries, they were scrambling, desperate to find another way to reel me back in. They weren't doing this because they needed money. They were doing this because they needed control. But I wasn't playing their game. My husband and I ignored their demands, and after a few days of silence, I thought maybe they had finally backed off. Update 2. A week after the whole "you owe us money" stunt, just when I thought the dust had settled, my dad called me out of nowhere and dropped another bombshell. There was no preamble, no attempt to ease into it. Just a blunt, matter-of-fact declaration, as if what he was saying was the most logical thing in the world. If you're not going to sell the house, then you and your husband will have to start paying rent. I felt the words settle in my chest like a stone, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard him. Rent? For my house. The house that was legally in my name. The house they had spent years convincing me was an investment in my future. The house they had sworn up and down would belong to me in the end. The sheer audacity of it was almost comical. I asked him to clarify, even though deep down, I already knew the answer. His tone didn't waver, didn't carry even the slightest trace of shame or hesitation. Technically, we've been the ones living here, he responded, as if that somehow justified this insanity. You put the house in your name, sure, but we've been maintaining it. We've been paying bills. It's only fair that you contribute something. Contribute. The word nearly made me laugh in disbelief. As if I hadn't already contributed. As if I hadn't already poured thousands of dollars into their lives over the years, always being the one to step in when they needed help, always sacrificing my own financial security for their comfort. As if I didn't still, to this day, pay my mother every single month for babysitting, even when she wasn't actually watching my son. As if I hadn't spent years living paycheck to paycheck, depriving myself of even the smallest luxuries so they wouldn't have to struggle. As if I hadn't, at one point, eaten out of a trash can just to make sure they had enough. As if I hadn't already done more for them than they had ever done for me. But of course, none of that mattered. It never did. This wasn't about fairness. It wasn't about logic. It was about control. It was about squeezing every last drop out of me until there was nothing left to take. They weren't asking me to contribute because they needed the money. They were asking me to contribute because they expected it. Because they believed they were entitled to it. Because they had convinced themselves that any financial stability I had was something I owed to them. And now that I was finally putting up boundaries, they were scrambling, desperate to find another way to keep their grip on me. It was so calculated, so deliberate. That was what made my stomach turn. This wasn't some heat-of-the-moment demand. This wasn't an impulsive request made out of desperation. This was planned. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew I wouldn't kick them out. They knew I wasn't that kind of person. They knew that I had spent my entire life being the dutiful daughter, the one who shouldered responsibilities that were never mine to carry. They knew that guilt had always been their strongest weapon, and they wielded it masterfully. If they couldn't manipulate me into selling the house, they would try a new approach, make my life unbearable enough that I would cave and give them what they wanted. But I wasn't going to play along. Not this time. I told them no. I wasn't paying rent for my own house. I wasn't handing over money just because they had decided they were entitled to it. I wasn't going to be their cash cow any longer. And just like before, the moment my father realized I wasn't going to comply, the manipulation turned to rage. He accused me of being selfish, of being ungrateful, of taking advantage of them. He painted me as a heartless daughter who wanted to see her own parents homeless. After everything we've done for you, he spat, as if that single sentence could erase all the times I had sacrificed my own well-being for theirs. As if it could erase all the ways I had given until I had nothing left. As if it would break me the way it used to. But it didn't. I was done being broken by them. I told him if he truly believed he had a legal claim, he was welcome to take me to court. I expected him to scream, to argue, to throw another tantrum. I expected him to hurl more insults, to try and guilt me into submission. But I had underestimated just how far they were willing to go. Because instead of empty threats, they actually followed through. A few days later, I received an email. My stomach tightened the moment I saw the sender. I clicked it open, my breath catching in my throat as I stared at the attachment. A lease agreement. A legally binding document. My own parents had drawn up a formal contract stating that my husband and I would owe them monthly rent, for our own home. They had put it all in writing. Payment terms. Due dates. Penalties for late payments. It was all there, laid out in meticulous legal detail, as if we were strangers. As if I were some tenant they had taken in out of the kindness of their hearts. As if this wasn't an insane power play on their part. I sat there, staring at the document, a strange mix of fury and exhaustion washing over me. It was absurd. It was insulting. And worst of all, it confirmed something I had known deep down for a long time but hadn't wanted to admit. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about control. This was about power. This was about making sure I knew they still had a hold over me, and they would use every tool at their disposal to remind me of that. Update 3. After weeks of tension so thick it felt like a second skin, my husband finally sat me down. He had that look in his eyes, the one he got when he had been thinking too hard for too long, when he had already made up his mind about something before he even said it out loud. I could tell he wasn't bringing up a new fight. He wasn't looking for another argument with my parents. He just wanted a way out. A way to end the endless cycle we had been trapped in. The weight of it all had been pressing down on both of us, suffocating our home, invading our peace, turning every conversation into a ticking time bomb that threatened to explode into another argument about what to do next. We had tried standing firm. We had tried saying no. And yet, no matter how many times I told myself I was done being manipulated, they always found another way to pull me back in. Let's just get rid of the problem. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken exhaustion. At first, I didn't understand. It was such a vague thing to say, and for a fleeting second, a wild part of me wondered if he was suggesting we cut them off entirely, change our numbers, move somewhere they couldn't reach, disappear from their lives altogether. And a part of me, a very large part of me, wanted that. The fantasy of it, of finally being free, of never having to deal with another guilt trip, another demand, another exhausting, soul-sucking manipulation, it was intoxicating. But I also knew that, no matter how much I wanted to sever that connection, it wasn't that simple. My parents would never stop. They would never stop knocking on the door, calling my phone, texting my husband, finding new and inventive ways to try and wear me down. They had spent years perfecting the art of making me feel guilty for existing, and they weren't going to let go of their best trick just because I suddenly decided I didn't want to play anymore. So when my husband explained what he meant, I listened. He was talking about their debts. The excuse. The reason they had given for every manipulative move they had made, the foundation upon which all their demands were built. If we help them now, maybe we can finally end this cycle. If they had no debt, no immigration lawyer to pay, no financial disaster to dangle over my head like a guillotine, then what leverage would they have left? What argument would they use to justify their constant, insatiable need for more? If they had nothing left to guilt me with, if the emergency was finally over, then maybe, just maybe, they would stop. I hated the idea of it. Everything in me rebelled against the thought of handing them more money after everything they had put me through. I had given them so much. More than I ever should have. And I knew, that this was exactly what they wanted. That this was the endgame they had been pushing for from the beginning. And yet, what choice did I have? If I refused, they would never let it go. They would hold it over me forever, twisting and turning it until I was the villain in their story, the selfish daughter who abandoned them when they needed help the most. And as much as I wanted to believe I didn't care, as much as I wanted to say I was past letting them manipulate me, I knew deep down that their words still held power over me. That no matter how much I wanted to be free of them, part of me would always be shackled to the past, to the version of myself who had spent her whole life needing their approval. So we made them an offer. We would give them enough money to cover the immigration lawyer, to settle their debts, to finally climb out of the hole they had dug for themselves. But in return, they had to drop the rent demand. No more talks about leases, no more threats about making us pay to live in our own home. And most importantly, they had to stop trying to manipulate us for money. No more sudden emergencies, no more sob stories meant to pry open my wallet. This was a one-time deal. A final chance for them to prove that they could take what was given and let it be enough. They agreed immediately. Of course they did. The second they knew they were getting what they wanted, all the guilt trips, all the accusations of selfishness, all the dramatic declarations of how much I had wronged them, gone. Like they had never even happened. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. My dad, who had screamed at me just weeks before about how ungrateful I was, now spoke to me with warmth. My mom, who had all but declared me an enemy for daring to keep my own house, suddenly softened, telling me how much she appreciated everything I had done for them. And for a little while, things were peaceful. There were no phone calls, no veiled threats, no sudden emergencies that required my immediate financial assistance. My dad even thanked us, something I could count on one hand the number of times he had done in my entire life. My mom said they were relieved, that they felt like they could finally breathe again. I could see it in them, the way their shoulders weren't so tense, the way they stopped speaking about the future like it was some looming disaster waiting to consume them. It was the quietest our relationship had been in years. And I let myself believe, against all my better judgment, that this really was the end of it. That I had finally broken the cycle. That for the first time in years, the power struggle between us was over. But then, a few weeks later, my dad made an offhand comment over dinner that sent a chill down my spine. We had gone to visit them, something I had convinced myself was a good idea now that things had settled. We sat around the table, the tension of the last few months seemingly gone, the conversation light, almost normal. And then, as he reached for another bite of food, he said it. You know, we could always bring back the rent if you two start acting up again. Just something to keep in mind. I nearly choked. My husband, who had been quietly listening up until that point, reached under the table and squeezed my hand. He had heard it too. It wasn't a joke. He said it with the same casual tone someone might use to remind a guest to take an umbrella because it might rain later. Like it was just a fact. Like it was inevitable. Like it was always going to be there, lurking in the background, waiting to be used the moment we did something they didn't like. That was when it hit me. They had won this round, and they knew it. They had proof now, proof that if they pushed hard enough, manipulated me long enough, backed me into a corner far enough, I would break. That I would give in. That I would pay. They had actual, tangible evidence that their tactics worked. So no, the problem isn't solved. Not really. The debts may be gone, but the dynamic hasn't changed. Because as long as my parents see me as a financial safety net, as long as they believe they have some kind of leverage over me, this will never truly be over. The only difference now is that I see them clearly for who they are. If they want to repeat something like this, I won't listen to them.